Jake stood frozen at the edge of his driveway, staring at the empty space where his truck had always been. His heart raced, his pulse quickened. The world seemed to pause for a moment, leaving him stuck in confusion. "Where the hell is it?" he muttered under his breath. He turned in circles, looking down the street, praying he had just forgotten where he'd parked it. But nothing. No sign of his truck. Not even a shadow of his trusty old pickup. Panic gripped him. The very truck that had carried him through every job, every tough day, every long night gone. Was it stolen? No, that couldn't be it. It was parked in his own driveway, for crying out loud. There was no way anyone would dare take it. And yet, it was gone. Then, just as his mind raced through every possible explanation, the one person he never wanted to see appeared. Mrs. Thompson. She was watering her garden, not even looking up as Jake stormed past her. But her voice called out, breaking his frantic thoughts. "Everything all right, Jake?" she asked casually, like she hadn't noticed the complete panic written across his face. "My truck's gone," he snapped, desperate for some kind of explanation. "Oh, that truck?" she said, her voice practically dripping with disinterest. "Yeah, Karen had it towed last night. She said it violated HOA rules." His blood ran cold. "Karen," he repeated, the name sticking in his throat. "The HOA president?" "Yep," she said with a shrug, continuing to water her plants as if this was the most normal thing in the world. "You really should read those newsletters she hands out." The world around him spun as anger surged through his chest. Karen Holloway, the neighborhood dictator, had stolen his truck from his own driveway? Over a rule? Before he even realized it, Jake was already walking toward her house. His fists clenched, his teeth gritted. He wasn't going to let this go. Not today. Not when she had gone too far. Karen was going to regret messing with the wrong guy. Jake's frustration bubbled up as he marched toward Karen's house. The pristine, immaculately manicured lawn stretched out before him. Every blade of grass cut to perfection. Every rose bush in full bloom. Karen's house looked almost too perfect, like something out of a magazine. The kind of house that screamed, "I'm in charge." He stepped up to the front door and knocked hard. His knuckles struck the polished wood with a loud thud that echoed down the empty street. He wasn't sure if it was the early morning or his anger, but his heart was pounding. A moment later, the door swung open, revealing Karen, looking as flawless as ever. "Oh, Jake, what a surprise," she said, greeting him with a wide, too pleasant smile. She stood there, arms crossed, a picture of smugness. "Karen," Jake said through gritted teeth, "you had my truck towed. My truck from my own driveway." "Why?" Karen stepped back slightly, giving him that look. The one she always used when she felt superior to everyone around her. She tilted her head, an innocent smile still on her face. "Oh, Jake, sweetheart, it's really not personal. It's just HOA rules. You see, anything bigger than a standard sedan has to be parked in a garage overnight. And your truck, well, it doesn't quite fit that criteria." Jake's jaw clenched. "It was parked in my driveway, not on the street. What's the problem?" Karen continued, her voice dripping with sweetness. "Oh, it's just how it is around here, Jake. As president of the HOA, I have to enforce these guidelines. It's my duty to keep order, you know? We wouldn't want chaos in our neighborhood. Imagine what might happen if we let every single person break the rules." She looked up at the sky as if contemplating the downfall of society. Jake wanted to scream. "You've got to be kidding me. My truck is my livelihood. It's not some decoration you get to decide the fate of." Karen simply raised a hand in the air, her fingers twirling as if she were conducting an orchestra. "Rules are rules, Jake," she said, almost too cheerfully. "If we don't follow them, we risk things getting out of control. You don't want to be the guy who lets things slip, do you?" Jake could feel his blood boiling. He clenched his fists, trying to keep calm. "You're taking this too far. It's just a truck in my own driveway." "Oh, Jake," Karen sighed dramatically. "You can pick up your truck once you pay the towing fee and the fine. Think of it as a lesson in responsibility. A little reminder of the importance of community standards." Jake stood there, stunned by her calm, condescending tone. His mind raced. She was seriously acting like she had done him a favor. He turned on his heel and stormed off her porch, feeling like he had just been patronized in the most ridiculous way. As he stepped onto the sidewalk, the weight of the situation hit him. He wasn't just angry anymore. He was determined. This wasn't about a truck. It was about the power trip she'd been on for far too long. She had pushed him too far, and now he was going to push back. Just then, Marty, his quirky neighbor, appeared out of nowhere, wearing his usual disheveled look. A bright blue smoothie in hand, his thick-rimmed glasses sliding down his nose, he seemed completely unaffected by the tension in the air. "Well, that went well," Marty said, taking a sip of his smoothie. "So, what's the plan now? You gonna let her get away with this?" Jake's frustration was palpable, his fists clenched tight. "I can't believe her. She towed my truck like it was some kind of violation, just because it didn't fit her idea of what's acceptable." Marty nodded, completely unfazed by Jake's anger. "Yeah, I get it. It's Karen, right? She's always been a bit of a dictator." He paused, his eyes lighting up behind his glasses. "You know, I have an idea. We could turn the tables on her. Use her own rules against her." Jake gave him a puzzled look. "What do you mean?" Marty took another sip of his smoothie, his face lighting up with mischief. "I mean, we dig into the HOA rulebook, right? Find some of the ridiculous rules she's been enforcing. If she's going to be such a stickler for guidelines, why not make her stick to them? Every last one." Jake raised an eyebrow. "Are you suggesting we play by her rules?" Marty shrugged nonchalantly. "Not just play by them, my friend. We're going to use every single one of those absurd rules to our advantage. Let her feel the pain of her own dictatorship. She wants rules. Fine. Let's enforce them on everyone. It'll be a little chaos, but controlled chaos. The best part? She'll have no way out. We'll have her caught in her own game." Jake couldn't help but smile, despite himself. Marty's oddball logic always had a way of making things feel less hopeless. He hadn't thought about hitting Karen with her own game plan. "You really think this could work?" Jake asked, a small grin forming on his face. Marty grinned right back. "I'm telling you, Jake, sometimes the best way to take down a tyrant is to out-twerp them. We play by the rules, but we take it to a whole new level. She won't know what hit her." Jake couldn't deny the spark of excitement that was slowly replacing his frustration. Maybe Marty was right. If Karen wanted to make a big deal out of the rules, then maybe it was time to make her realize how absurd she was being. "All right, Marty. Let's do this. Let's make her regret ever messing with my truck." Jake and Marty sat at Jake's kitchen table, surrounded by piles of old rulebooks, newsletters, and pamphlets from the HOA. The space looked more like the office of a conspiracy theorist than the home of a guy trying to get his truck back. The smell of stale coffee lingered in the air as Marty flipped through the brittle pages, eyes scanning quickly. "Here we go," Marty said, almost triumphantly, as he stopped on a page. "Listen to this. No garden decorations shall exceed 12 inches in height, nor shall they promote discord in the community." He looked up, a grin spreading across his face. "Discord? Who knew gnomes could cause a riot?" Jake stared at him, wide-eyed. "Wait, that's a rule? No decorations over 12 inches? Are we living in some kind of dictatorship?" Marty chuckled, adjusting his glasses. "You think that's bad? Hold on." He flipped a few more pages dramatically before finding another section. "No vehicle shall exceed the width of a standard garage door when parked in the driveway unless previously approved by the HOA board." He shook his head in disbelief. "I mean, what even is this? Karen's been using this crap to control the neighborhood." Jake sat back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "This is insane. No one's ever heard of these rules. She's literally making stuff up as she goes along." Marty nodded eagerly, flipping through more pages, clearly delighted. "Oh, it gets better. According to this, any noise created by a lawnmower must not exceed 70 decibels or must be scheduled with the HOA for approval. I'm starting to think we live in a weird suburban prison." He laughed, clearly entertained by the absurdity of it all. Jake felt his anger shift slightly. This was madness, but at least it was kind of funny. "So what you're saying is she's been enforcing these outdated, completely random rules, and now she's trying to tow my truck for something that doesn't even exist?" Marty grinned. "Exactly. And she's been doing this for years. Nobody dared question her because, well, who's going to stand up to the HOA president, right? But now we know the truth, and that gives us the upper hand." Jake's expression hardened again as he thought about his truck. "All right, Marty. We've got her. But now we need to get to work. If we're going to turn the tables, we need to make sure we've got proof. Tons of it." Marty's eyes lit up. "I've got just the thing. We start documenting every single violation. Every garbage can, every mailbox, every flower pot that violates her precious rules. We'll flood her with violations. And then we hit her with it." Jake stood up, a sense of determination creeping in. "Let's do it. Let's make her see what it's like when her own rules come back to bite her." The two of them spent the next few hours walking the streets of Willow Creek. They started with Mrs. Thompson's yard, where her garden gnome was parked suspiciously close to the sidewalk. "That gnome is practically anarchy," Marty joked, snapping a photo. Jake pointed to the neighbor's recycling bin, which was sitting a few inches past the curb. "Boom. Violation," he said, taking a picture. They moved down the block, checking off violations left and right. A mailbox was leaning slightly to the right, breaking the HOA's perfectly aligned rule. "That's got to be a fine," Marty said, grinning as he added it to their list. Jake couldn't help but laugh at the ridiculousness of it all. He was still fuming over his truck, but seeing these small, petty violations gave him a strange sense of satisfaction. "We're really doing this, huh?" he said, shaking his head in disbelief. "Absolutely," Marty replied, tapping away at his phone. "If she wants to play by these stupid rules, we're going to make her play by every single one of them. This is going to be great." They continued on, documenting everything they could find. From lawn decorations that were too tall to hedges that might have been an inch over the limit, the list was growing fast. By the time they were done, they had a mountain of evidence, enough to drown Karen in her own absurdity. Jake took a deep breath, feeling the weight of what they were about to do. "This is it, Marty. We've got her. Let's bring the storm." Jake and Marty stood in Jake's living room, peering out the window as the first of the tow trucks pulled up to the curb. Their carefully compiled list of violations had been sent off to a local towing company that morning, and now, the moment of revenge was finally unfolding. "Here we go," Marty whispered, eyes gleaming with excitement as the tow truck made its way down the street. "The first car's up." Jake clenched his fists, watching the tow truck slowly back up into Mrs. Thompson's driveway. The massive truck, with its tow bed rising, pulled the offending vehicle out of the driveway and began to haul it off. The neighbors didn't seem to know what was going on at first, but as soon as the truck pulled away with Mrs. Thompson's car, confusion rippled through the street. It didn't take long before a couple of them started looking out their windows and stepping outside, staring at the empty space where a car had just been. "What the hell is going on?" Mrs. Thompson exclaimed, standing at the edge of her perfectly trimmed yard. She didn't seem angry, just confused. "Why's my car being towed?" Jake barely suppressed a smile as he leaned back, watching the chaos unfold. "That's just the beginning," he muttered under his breath. The tow trucks moved swiftly down the street, hauling away cars that were parked too close to the curb, violating height limits on garden decorations, or just having the audacity to break some HOA rule that no one had ever taken seriously before. The steady hum of the tow trucks echoed down the quiet suburban street, and with each car that disappeared, the neighborhood's confusion grew. "Karen's gonna have a field day with this," Marty said with a grin, rubbing his hands together. "I can already hear her yelling." Jake nodded, his mind focused on the chaos unfolding. There was something undeniably satisfying about watching Karen's own carefully constructed world start to crack. The rules she had enforced for so long with such certainty were now coming back to bite her, and everyone else was starting to notice. A few more cars were towed, each one causing more confusion. More people standing in their yards, arms folded, murmuring amongst themselves. The air was thick with a mix of disbelief and curiosity. By the time the last car was being hauled away, the entire block had turned into an impromptu gathering of stunned neighbors. Everyone watched, some in shock, others in outrage. And then came the moment Jake had been waiting for. Karen's silver sedan, the one that had been parked proudly in her perfectly organized driveway, was now being towed. As the truck approached her house, Jake could barely contain his grin. "What's happening?" Karen's voice rang out from behind her front door, a note of panic creeping into her tone. She must have seen the trucks lining up, and her perfectly controlled world was starting to crumble. She stormed outside, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement. Jake watched from across the street as she marched toward the tow truck, her face turning red with each step. "Hey," she shouted, her voice shrill. "What do you think you're doing? That's my car." Jake could barely hear her from where he was, but her angry, high-pitched voice was unmistakable. She was livid, her arms flailing as she tried to make sense of what was happening. The tow truck driver didn't seem fazed at all. He simply glanced at her and said, "Your car's violating the neighborhood guidelines, ma'am. Can't leave it parked like this. HOA rules." Jake felt a small rush of victory. He leaned in close to Marty, his grin widening. "That's poetic," he whispered. "Her own rules are doing her in." Karen was standing in front of the truck now, her face contorted with rage. "What do you mean my car's being towed? You can't do this. Who authorized this? This is an absolute travesty." The driver simply shrugged. "I'm just following orders, ma'am." He motioned to the paperwork. "You'll have to take it up with the HOA." Jake and Marty exchanged a look from across the street, their satisfaction growing with each second of Karen's mounting frustration. "I'll have your jobs for this," Karen shouted at the tow truck driver, her voice practically cracking from the strain. "You've gone too far, all of you." Jake watched, a mix of amusement and disbelief painting his face. He wanted to walk over, to confront her, but there was something so sweet about seeing her lose control in front of everyone. She had always been so composed, so in charge. Now she was losing it, her world collapsing around her in real time. "You can't get away with this," Karen continued, her hands on her hips as she looked at the crowd of neighbors, her voice dripping with venom. "I'll make sure everyone knows who did this." Jake's grin never faltered. He wasn't worried. She was already losing the battle, and she didn't even realize it. Her authority had always relied on fear and intimidation. But today, everyone was watching her unravel, and they were starting to see the truth. Karen stormed back to her house, her face pale, her hands trembling. She slammed the door behind her, and the crowd dispersed slowly, muttering to themselves, some looking at Jake with a newfound respect. "I think the storm's just beginning," Marty said with a laugh, raising his smoothie in the air. "But it's good to see the queen knocked off her throne." Jake took a deep breath, his satisfaction tempered by the knowledge that this was only the beginning. What they had started today, what Karen had unwittingly ignited, was only going to grow. There was more to do, but for now, watching her unravel in front of everyone felt like the perfect first step. Jake stood at the edge of the park, looking out at the crowd that had gathered in response to his invitation. The air was thick with anticipation. Neighbors exchanged cautious glances, some whispering, some waiting for something to happen. Jake cleared his throat, his mind racing with everything he had to say. This wasn't just about a truck anymore. It was bigger than that. He stepped forward, raising his hand to quiet the crowd. Slowly, the murmurs died down and everyone's eyes turned to him. Karen stood at the back, her arms crossed defensively, her eyes narrowed in suspicion. She had no idea what was coming. "Thank you all for coming," Jake began, his voice steady but filled with a quiet intensity. "We've been living under the shadow of a system that's been built on lies. For too long, Karen Holloway has used the HOA to control this neighborhood. She's been making up rules, enforcing fines, and taking money from us, all while pretending to protect our community." The crowd shifted uncomfortably, their faces a mixture of confusion and curiosity. Jake took a breath, knowing this would be the moment that changed everything. "She's had my truck towed for an infraction that doesn't even exist in the official HOA guidelines," Jake continued. "And that's just the beginning. We've found evidence of more rules that Karen has been pulling out of thin air, enforcing fines for things that aren't even in the books." A few people in the crowd exchanged looks. A murmur went through them, and Jake could feel the weight of their growing doubts about Karen. He paused for a moment, letting the tension build. And the worst part, he turned and pointed toward Karen, his voice growing stronger. "She's been using the HOA funds for herself, misusing money that's supposed to benefit the neighborhood. Money that should have been used to maintain this community has instead lined her pockets. It's all here in the evidence we've gathered." Karen's face turned ashen, and she stepped forward, her eyes wide with panic. "That's ridiculous," she spat. "You have no proof. This is all just nonsense." But Jake was ready for this. He pulled out a stack of papers from his jacket and held them up for the crowd to see. The documents, covered in signatures and receipts, were the smoking gun he needed. "Here's the proof, Karen," Jake said calmly. "These records show inflated expenses, unauthorized withdrawals, and funds being funneled into accounts that you control. You can try to deny it, but the truth is here. You've been stealing from all of us." The crowd fell into stunned silence. Karen's mouth opened and closed, as if she were trying to find the words to defend herself. But the more she looked at the documents, the more her composure faltered. I don't know what you're talking about," Karen stammered, her voice growing weaker. She glanced nervously at the crowd, but they weren't looking at her the same way anymore. Just then, Gary, Karen's usually quiet husband, stepped forward from the back of the crowd. He looked more uncomfortable than Jake had ever seen him, but there was a look of determination in his eyes that made Jake's heart race. "I think I can help with that," Gary said quietly, his voice carrying across the park. The crowd turned toward him, and Karen's eyes shot to him with shock. "Gary, what are you doing?" Karen hissed, her voice cracking with panic. "Don't you dare." Gary ignored her, taking a deep breath before continuing. I've seen the documents. I've seen the bank statements, the transfers. Karen's been using HOA funds for her own personal benefit. And I've kept quiet for too long. The weight of Gary's words hit like a thunderclap. Jake's heart pounded in his chest, and he saw the shift in the crowd. More people were looking at Karen with suspicion now. "You're lying," Karen screamed, her voice filled with rage and disbelief. "You're trying to ruin me." But Gary stood firm, his voice steady as he spoke again. "No, Karen. I've kept quiet long enough. I was too afraid to speak out before, but not anymore. This is the truth." Karen's face went white as the crowd closed in, the betrayal from her own husband crashing over her like a wave. The air was thick with tension, and for the first time, Karen seemed small, desperate, like she was losing control. The murmurs from the crowd grew louder, and Jake felt a small sense of triumph. This was it, the moment when everything changed. "Thank you, Gary," Jake said, his voice clear. "You've done the right thing." Karen's eyes flickered with a mix of fear and anger, but there was no denying it now. The truth was out, and she could no longer hide behind her power. The crowd was turning. For the first time, Karen was the one who seemed cornered, and Jake knew that the battle was just beginning. As the crowd murmured and shifted uneasily, the air in the park thickened with tension. Jake stood tall, eyes fixed on Karen, who was now backed into a corner. Her expression was a mixture of disbelief, anger, and desperation. She had never imagined this would happen. She had always been in control, never considering the possibility that her reign over the neighborhood could end so abruptly. The murmurs from the neighbors grew louder, their voices carrying an undercurrent of anger and disillusionment. They had been living under Karen's thumb for far too long, fearful of challenging her. But now, with the truth laid bare, they found their voices. One by one, people started to speak out. "She's been stealing from us for years," Mr. Wilkins called out. "She's been controlling everything for her own benefit. I don't even know how we let this go on for so long," Mrs. Thompson added, her voice shaking with a mix of anger and relief. Jake took a step forward, his heart pounding as the crowd's momentum grew. "We've been lied to. We've been manipulated," he said, his voice steady and firm. "But we're not going to let it happen anymore. Not here. Not in this community." With each word, the crowd grew more unified. People who had once been divided by Karen's manipulations were now standing together. Their trust in her had been shattered, and there was no going back. Karen, realizing she was losing the battle, turned toward the police officers who had arrived quietly at the scene. They stood at the edge of the crowd, their expressions professional and calm, but the sense of finality was clear. "Ma'am," one of the officers said, his tone polite but firm, "we're going to have to ask you to leave the premises." Karen spun around, her face flushed with rage. "This is outrageous. You can't do this. I'm the HOA president," she screamed, her voice high-pitched and desperate. The officer remained unfazed, his voice steady. "You've been accused of embezzlement, making up rules, and using your position to control the neighborhood for personal gain. You're being removed from your position." Karen opened her mouth to protest, but no words came out. She was defeated, the power she had once wielded so effortlessly now slipping through her fingers. Slowly, she turned and walked toward her house, the police officers following behind her. As they reached the door, Karen turned one last time to the crowd, her eyes blazing with fury. "This isn't over," she hissed, her voice trembling. "I'll make sure you all regret this." But the crowd had already moved on. The whispers of approval, the nods of agreement, and the quiet relief from the neighbors made it clear. Willow Creek had been freed. Jake watched Karen disappear inside her house, her figure becoming smaller and smaller until the door slammed shut behind her. For a moment, there was silence. But then, the neighbors began to speak to each other again, more relaxed now, some even smiling. Gary, still standing in the background, finally stepped forward. He didn't look as confident as Karen had, but there was something about him, something real and grounded. "I know I haven't always been the loudest voice," Gary began, his voice surprisingly clear. "But I promise you, as the new HOA president, I will lead with honesty and fairness. No more rules for the sake of control. No more fines for nothing. We'll be transparent, and we'll work together to make this a community again." Jake felt a weight lift off his shoulders. He had been so caught up in taking down Karen that he hadn't thought much about what came next. But hearing Gary speak, there was a sense of hope, a feeling that things were going to be different from now on. The crowd cheered, clapping for Gary, the man who had once been Karen's quiet husband, but now stood as the voice of reason for the entire neighborhood. "Thank you, Gary," Jake said, stepping forward and shaking his hand. "This place needs you." Gary smiled modestly, his eyes filled with gratitude. "I won't let you down. Not again." As the crowd began to break up, Jake felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in years. The neighborhood was healing, and with Gary at the helm, it felt like there was finally a chance for real change. Jake glanced over at Marty, who had been silently watching the scene unfold. Marty grinned, raising his smoothie cup. "Well, that was fun. Not every day you get to take down a tyrant." Jake laughed, the tension finally easing. "Yeah, well, let's hope it's the last time we have to do something like this." The community was shifting. What had once been divided, ruled by fear and suspicion, was now filled with a new sense of unity. As the sun began to set, the streets of Willow Creek felt different, lighter, freer. And Jake knew deep down that things would never be the same again. Jake stood on his front porch, watching as the neighborhood slowly came back to life. The streets were quieter now, no longer filled with whispers of fear or suspicion. Willow Creek had changed. It felt like a weight had been lifted, like the sun had finally broken through the clouds. The community, once divided by Karen's grip, was now united. People smiled at each other, chatting as they went about their business. The neighborhood cookout was in full swing. Kids ran around, laughing and playing, while the adults mingled, some gathered around the grill, others sitting at the picnic tables, exchanging stories. The tension that had hung in the air for so long was gone, replaced by a sense of freedom, a sense of belonging. For the first time in ages, the neighbors were together, not as enemies but as a true community. Jake stood by the grill, flipping burgers and laughing with Marty, who was trying his best to convince everyone that his special smoothies were a must-try. Even Mrs. Thompson, who had once scowled at every imperfection, was joking with the others about how her roses had survived Karen's reign. And then, unexpectedly, Karen appeared. She stood at the edge of the yard, hesitating as everyone turned to look. She seemed smaller now, less confident, but there was no anger in her eyes, just a quiet vulnerability. Gary, standing next to Jake, nodded toward her. "Maybe it's time," he said. With a deep breath, Jake walked over to Karen, offering a smile. "You're welcome to join us," he said, his voice steady but kind. Karen hesitated for a moment before nodding, a small, genuine smile tugging at the corners of her lips. She took a seat at the table, and the conversations resumed. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. As the evening wore on, Jake reflected on how far they had come. This wasn't just the end of a battle. It was the beginning of something new, something better. Willow Creek was home again,